to talk about your perspective on what is happening in independent watchmaking today. I think just maybe let's start by what do you see yourself and other kind of brands that are part of this sort of new wave of independent watchmaking? How do you see that that's taking shape in today's landscape? And again, kind of what you observe with peers, or feel free to, of course, speak to your personal approach.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a new shift, it's a new trend that we witness through the years. If I were to summarize it, I would say that in a nutshell, it's the evolution of going past the sheer location of stuff for the sake of the location. I think if you were to look 20 years, 15 years, or even 10 years back, the origin of where something is made was the sort of primary information that mattered when we were assessing watches. It's it's a Swiss watch, it's a German watch, it's whatever watch. But what I see happening nowadays is a shift from the where to the who or how, and it's kind of a recognition that talent could be anywhere, and that those new sort of independence, they will sort of focus on who does the best and wherever that could be. And what I see is that it goes beyond purely, the making of stuff, but it also extends more importantly to the creativity aspect. The sort of ideation and generation of concept is also part of the global equation, and I see that happening with quite a few brands. And then for us it's funny because initially our brand was all about making things in China and sort of having a point that we could be making really cool watches in a location that is not necessarily known for making cool watches. Location that makes watch parts for everyone, but that doesn't really have brands. They make stuff, but they don't really have brands. And we started and we were very adamant about making everything in China. And then eventually, as time went by, the approach sort of had to change. And we started sourcing things in different locations, in France and other countries. And we kind of realized, well, no, maybe we're onto something. And we looked at the landscape and we saw that we're not the only ones doing that. There were brands for instance, Ming. I think Ming is a great example. It's a guy in Malaysia who does all the ideation, and then they do things in Switzerland, they do things in Germany, they do things in China, in the US. And I could see that, there were some other brands like that, and that's when I had this kind of light bulb moment, and I thought, okay, maybe that's a new playbook of the independent watchmakers.
And I think you brought up something really interesting. So decades and decades ago, this établissage system of not having everything in-house, but going to different artisans, going to different makers, whether it's from the technical side of components or the more creative sides, that used to be how many brands operated in the industry, but it was still kind of regionally specific at least. And I think something that you brought to light that's really interesting is maybe what the current landscape and how accessible other geographic spaces are. You named so many different countries where both your brand and some other brands that you gave examples are working across borders. Is there any more to say about that and kind of what you think working geographically across so many different landscapes and how that's able to help you source everything you need to fulfill a specific vision for a watch that you want to create?
So I think it's as you said, it's we're going back to that old system of établissement, but it's now with a very global scale, because I think when that happened, communication was limited, transportation was limited, so you had to do it very originally, but now it's happening again in the 21st century, and therefore the scale can be much wider. I think maybe in the early 2000s there was a very strong focus on this ideal or this idea of making things in-house, and a lot of brands played a lot of that image that they would be the full in-house manufacture, and that appealed to a lot of collectors. Of course, that was not always true. It's true there were some that were built in-house, like Rolex, for instance, but most of the other brands had to rely on third parties for the stuff. And I think now this is eroding, this idea, because I think collectors are not stupid. They can also see what is really happening. We live in an era of like greater transparency, greater visibility, so now they can hold brands accountable and see what's true or what's not true. And as such, we are sort of more openly embracing back the reality of things, which is that it happens a system. And yeah, it happens globally, and you can therefore distribute all the different aspects, whether that's craft, whether that's parts, whether that's even the creativity, the ideation, the concepts, all across the globe. And I see for ourselves, we have some designers in Hong Kong, some designers in Italy. Recently we started working with like a painter, like to do like little like artistic rendering of our watches I think he's in Kazakhstan. And then we worked with him because he was just really good, and we see the talent is really everywhere. Same goes with the suppliers or partners and whatnot.
And so you've mentioned so many different elements that go into the creation of a watch, from kind of practical, logistical components that need to be sourced on the technical side, to maybe artistic techniques that you want to be able to achieve on a dial. Different materials are at play. There's so many things that go into creating a timepiece. So I'm wondering, to kind of make this tangible for everyone in the audience here, is there maybe a particular collection or a particular watch that you could kind of give us an example and maybe walk through each of those aspects, and kind of how you go about sourcing the things that you need, again, which may come from a very practically driven place, but in other areas it's maybe really finding a particular artisan or a particular source for material that can help you to execute a vision. So I'd love if you could maybe speak to a particular collection of yours and kind of walk through exactly how that process goes in sort of sourcing every person and everything to bring it together from all these different resources.
Yeah, for sure. I think I can talk about the latest perception, because to me it's a great embodiment of that stance. So if we start from the pure ideation of things, the watch was designed in Hong Kong. We've been working with the same designer for a few years. So he ideated the whole thing, but then we have the movement that's made in France, and we still wanted to sort of like showcase the DNA of the brands through the movement. So we worked with two other designers, one in France, another one in China, to redesign that movement. And then we decided to incorporate lacquer in the movement, and we sourced that lacquer from like a traditional lacquer maker in China. So we sourced the lacquer in China, shipped it to France, and then they finished the movement with that lacquer. When it comes to the watch itself, what's very interesting is that even though like the specific marks are made in China, we collaborated very closely with like some kind of industry veterans in Germany, France, and Switzerland to learn how we could improve. So we approached those guys who spent like 20 years, 30 years at some of the big suppliers that work for like AP and whatnot, and we asked them, how do you do that? And they told us, and then we went to our Chinese guys, we told them that's the machine you need to use, which are like German or Swiss machine, and then you can see it's therefore very global stuff, like the parts may be made in China, but the amount of people that collaborated into that is very global. And then the last bit, which to me is quite interesting, is the Kiyoshi dial. So this one is like fully made in the center of China by a guy who's like fully self-taught, built his own rose engine, and does everything in his workshop. But what I think is interesting is that Kiyoshi is not a Chinese craft at all. It's something very European, very like French-Swiss. So he still took that technique, got inspired by it. It's an 18th century technique, and then like sort of trying to redo it with his own style in China. So he built his own machine, which is a the traditional Swiss or French way, and you therefore have this kind of mix of origin, which tells you that at the end of the day, origin doesn't matter. It's more like the actual product, the actual output that's relevant.
So what's coming to me, which is a word that was discussed in a panel that I was hosting yesterday here, is this word collaboration. And you're talking about all these moving parts that kind of have to be negotiated with each other. And it's in kind of an interesting form of collaboration, maybe not the traditional sense that we would think of it in this industry. So I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that arise when you're kind of working with people in different disciplines and across different geographic locations, and even as you kind of mentioned, with different roots in watchmaking and maybe some fundamentally different approaches to watchmaking? So what are some of the challenges that arise that you've had to kind of overcome in building this ecosystem? And on the flip side, what are some of the maybe kind of creative surprises that have come that maybe have resulted in an end product that was even better than maybe what you initially imagined because of how people's work has kind of played off of each other?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the more obvious one is that it's logistically sometimes quite challenging to sort of orchestrate, because suddenly you have people that speak different languages across different time zones, different working styles, and you need to make sure that everything will sort of fit neatly all together. So I mean, it may seem very trivial, but in practice it's not. It can be quite hard. It can be quite hard for people to understand each other and sort of speak the same language. And it's quite interesting because we could think that we're in a world where everything is super connected, where everything can be translated, but at the end of the day, what really remains is still the human nature. People are fundamentally sometimes from different culture, and with all the tech in the world, all the support that you want, still the way they behave will not change. So sometimes for us that can be really hard to make them work all together very, very nicely. I would say some of the upsides that we found were kind of consequences of maybe local characteristics, some environments. So one example is that our guilloche master, this Rollers engine, a very critical part of the Rose engine is the cutting tool that we have at the tip, how it's shaped, how it's sharpened, that will influence at the end of the day how the pattern is done. And in Switzerland they use a very special steel to do that, and it's kind of hard to buy it. It's not very much exported, so we couldn't find that. And he had to kind of improvise, and he decided to use diamonds, very, very sharp diamonds, industrial diamonds, of course, not the ones you put in jewelry, industrial diamonds. And it turns out the result was even better than expected, because it's extremely sharp and extremely cutting. Through the lack of availability, we're able to get something that's more interesting than it would be.
So now kind of taking a step out and broadening the scope a little bit, you beautifully referenced some other colleagues of yours that you kind of consider part of this new wave of independent watchmakers. I'm curious, is there anybody that you are inspired by, you think something that they're doing is really interesting in the way that they are approaching independent watchmaking today? And then also bringing it back to Atelier Wind, is there something that you all think that you are doing that's kind of leading and carving the path for maybe up and coming independent brands that want to emerge and kind of be able to follow this playbook that is proving successful in the market today?
I think for us, the one that really paved the way was maybe this, I referenced them before, but this brand called Me, that really showed us that at the end of the day, location doesn't matter. It's more, who's with you in the team, who you're working with, and what are your ideas, and they started a bit before us, but very, very quickly they made a point, and so that really inspired us. And then there's another brand, it's more like a small independent watchmaker in Switzerland called Simon Brett. What I really like about him and his team is that from the get-go they were insanely transparent about who does what, you know, like for each of the parts they would give the supplier, the person, the reason why they went for it, and they sort of also by themselves debunked that myth that it needs to be all in-house or all in one place. And they had people from all across Europe, and even some of the craftsmen, like some of them, I think there's one that comes from North Africa, one that comes from somewhere else, and they really adamantly and proudly showed that it's, you know, you can build it this very transparent way, and again, you don't need to care about your origin as long as you're confident about those people who building the watch with you. So yeah, I would say those two.
And I'm gonna come back, and I appreciate you like elevating others in the space and giving some beautiful examples of other brands, but I'm gonna come back to you and ask you again, feel free to speak also proudly about yourself and the brand. Like, what do you think that you are doing to kind of also carry that baton and push the industry forward? And yeah, like, what would you like to highlight about what you guys think that you're doing in a really strong way that's setting an example for other people that are kind of coming up behind you in the space?
I think three things. Like the first one is that we've always been mega transparent about what we're doing. When we were just starting the brand, we were discussing with extensive details and like forums and whatnot, when there was still a thing like how the building is, and we wanted to have this kind of like open sort of mentality to be more genuine and in the end to inspire more trust. So that was the first one. I think the second one, which sort of goes back to the early days of the brand, there was like fully embracing like making things in China with pride and not just making but ideating. And I think at the beginning that shocked a lot of people. But then eventually it also had us prove our point that the origin itself matters so much. And the last bit was like when we started working with like French and Swiss movement, but to us it's the final evolution of that approach of like, at the end of the day, the location itself is just a name. It's what matters, is what you use. And I think when we released the inflection, the GP movement, or the new conception of the ancestral stupidity movement as we in France, that really for us was the final point we could make, that now it's time to go beyond origins and just take the best and make the best possible watch.
And so you brought up a couple things. You mentioned the transparency a few times of, again, both yourself and other brands that are really letting collectors know, like, every person and every place that is poured into these watches. And the last thing you just said was to create the best possible watch, ultimately for the collector. So I'm wondering, again, kind of bringing it back to the people in the room here, because we've kind of gotten into the weeds about a lot of like business behind the scenes aspects. Why is all of this important for collectors? Why should collectors kind of care and be invested in how their watches are being made? Who is behind the scenes contributing to how these watches are made? Why is this important to the collector?
I think quite simply because at the end of the day, these are fairly expensive items, and you want to make sure that what you get is actually what you pay for, and that you're not paying for like some marketing fluff or like some kind of made up ideas that just exist in thin air. If you're gonna even like affordable watches in the grand scheme of things, they are not affordable. It's still a lot of money. If you're gonna dedicate that budget, and you want to make sure that the thing was actually made with care, with creativity, with effort, with craft. think watch inherently are like fairly useless items. You know, you don't really use them to tell time. You have your phone, that's way more accurate. In watches, they only exist for themselves, you know, like pieces of art. So you want to make sure that real artistry went behind, and that it's not just someone who pretended that there is artistry and thus kind of made money on it. So I think as collectors, if we really like the watches, we should care about how they are made and what we get at the end of the day. So yeah, that's why I think this transparency is super important. Also taking the approach that location doesn't matter too much, and or what you get is what matters. It's also important.
So before I open up to you all for any questions that you might have for Robin, the last question I always ask when I'm in conversation with someone is there anything that I should have asked but didn't? Is there anything else that you think is important to say about this new playbook for independent watchmaking, how it's taking shape, how it's influencing the industry?
I think honestly you asked pretty much all the questions, so yeah, you were quite exhaustive.
Okay, great. Does anyone here have any questions for Robin around independent watchmaking? It could just be a question about Atelier Wind, any curiosities that you might still have lingering.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier, but I'd love to hear like where your love for watches came from initially, and like how that motivated you to like start up your company.
Yeah, for sure. So I got into watches when I was, I would say, fairly young. But initially it happened, I would say, almost randomly. Like I got a watch for one of my birthdays when I was a kid. And I don't know why it triggered something in me, you know, I just thought that the watch itself was really, really pretty and very interesting to look at, you know, all the different textures, the careful details. It was not a very expensive watch, it was like a quartz Seiko, so something very entry-level and accessible, but as a 14 years old kid, to me that was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my whole life. So I got quite obsessed with it, and then I started just researching online, first about my watch, because I wanted to see if other people had it, and of course, well, I guess tens of thousands had it, and what they were saying about it, to see if they shared my enthusiasm. And then, I just stumbled upon watch forums, and I could see people were talking about other watches, and suddenly I thought, oh wow, you know, it's some of those watches, they have mechanical movements, and it seems even more interesting, because then there's gears, wheels, and cogs, and that's how then I got into Chinese watches, because I really wanted a mechanical watch, but obviously I couldn't really afford one. And there were those people who were buying old Chinese mechanical watches, which back then were very, very accessible and of quite good quality. And I got my first one, my second one, my third one, and then, without noticing, it started taking all my free time, and I never had some time going online, reading about more watches, and I think then when it takes so much space in your life and head, you just think about watches all the time, and when I was in uni, I was wondering what I should be doing after. I was like, oh, well, why not making watches, because all I think about are watches. Yeah, that's how it happened.
If that's okay, I have two questions.
For sure.
Given how many parts and sourcing is needed to build your watches, whether it's talent or product, do you have an actual steady headquarters where everything is built, or is it also built all over the place?
So we have like 2 or 3 places where we'll assemble the watches. Before we used to have only one, but for a bunch of reasons it started being too complex to have only one, because now that we have parts in Switzerland and in France, the flows are getting a bit messy. Usually we have one place where we want to sort of like have everything together the watch as a whole. That's why you build on QC and whatnot. As for like the kind of like upper stages in that process, you know, like when we design and develop those watches. So this is a bit more distributed. So we have a team in Hong Kong actually. So there's one guy in Hong Kong that works a bit on the development, and another guy who does design. And then we have one guy in mainland China that really does the day-to-day of the suppliers, like, you know, asking them how things are going, like checking progress, going to visit the workshop, checking quality and whatnot. Then myself, I talk to this guy almost on a daily basis because at our stage, I think like just the development and the making of the watches is really the most important stuff. So yeah, it's quite distributed, I'd say.
Second question, if I can. Can you please talk about your newest watch, and particularly about the material?
The inflection?
Yes, because
Yeah.
I'm super curious. I don't know about anybody else, but is it really the first time that integrated bracelet is achieved in that material? And like, why now? Why did you guys choose this material?
So it's the first time it was being made available commercially. We're not the first one to achieve the bracelet. There's two others that did the bracelet for us. It was June, they did a piece unique for the watch. And then Louis Vuitton that also did a piece unique for Jean. And we were the third, so we first made that prototype on my right wrist. And then eventually we launched that one. When we launched it, it was the first time ever that you had a full $10 integrated bracelet watch available for sale. Why did I go for that? Honestly, it's not very emotional. I just really like that metal. And when we began Perception in 2022, you know, we saw that maybe they can be scoped for kind of like a higher end integrated bracelet. And at the same time, I also felt that we kind of had this need to make like a flagship watch because otherwise many people would always see us as a small micro brand. Whereas like, well, if we're given the budget, we could also do like more ambitious stuff. So yeah, this kind of thought was in my mind, and when we were working on that project and deciding what it should be, at the end of the day, the decision was, okay, are we going to do precious metal or something else? And precious metals are really cool, but everyone does them, and I don't think we would bring any sort of differentiation from that. So because I really like Tantalum, and I realized no one was making it, I said, okay, let's try to do it, let's be the first. Part of me also just really wanted a Tantalum watch, and so that was the right opportunity to make it happen.
You know, it was a good decision. It looks amazing.
Thanks.
And the color is,
Thank you. Thank you.
what makes it very different is the color.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Final questions for Robin? Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.